The Lakota woman invited the ranch cook on Christmas Eve, and the night changed everything. The cold had settled deep into the land, wrapping the wide plains in a quiet white blanket that seemed to stretch forever. The ranch sat alone under a pale winter sky, its wooden buildings standing still like they were holding their breath. Smoke rose slowly from the small kitchen chimney, drifting into the soft evening air. Inside, the ranch cook moved from table to stove, stirring a pot that held little more than soup and roots. He had been working since sunrise, and now the sun had slipped behind the distant hills, leaving the world in blue and gray shadows. Christmas Eve had always meant family to him once. Long ago, it meant warm rooms, loud laughter, and the smell of bread fresh from the oven. Now, it meant silence, cold wind, and another night alone. He wiped his hands on a worn cloth and leaned against a counter for a moment, listening to the crackle of the fire in the stove. Outside, the wind brushed against the walls of the kitchen, whispering through the cracks in the wood. He picked up a small tin cup and poured himself some warm drink. It wasn't sweet, and it wasn't special, but it was warm. He held it close to his chest, letting the heat seep into his hands. His eyes drifted to the small window that faced the open plains. Snow lay in soft waves across the ground, shining faintly in the fading light. The world felt wide and empty, and for a moment he felt just as empty inside. A soft sound broke the quiet. It wasn't the wind this time. It was a footstep, slow and careful, crunching over the snow. He turned toward the door, unsure of what he might find. Visitors were rare this time of year, especially after dark. The sound came again, closer now. He set the cup down and reached for the door handle. When he opened the door, cold air rushed in, and with it came the sight of a woman standing just beyond the threshold. She wore a thick cloak that wrapped around her shoulders, and her dark hair was tied back to keep it from the wind. In her hands she held a small bundle wrapped in cloth and a few pieces of firewood tucked under her arm. They looked at each other in silence.
"Sorry, you guys now. Find out to be out bet your sister."
For a moment, neither spoke. The ranch cook noticed the way her breath rose in small clouds in the cold air. Narration. She noticed the tired lines on his face and the simple clothes he wore, stained from a long day of work. She lifted the bundle slightly as if to show him. Psst. Her voice was calm and steady when she finally spoke. She said she had come to share what little she had, knowing the night would be long and cold. He stepped aside without thinking, holding the door open wider. The warmth from inside reached her, and she paused for just a second before stepping in. The door closed behind her, shutting out the wind and the endless white plains. Inside, the light from the small lantern in the fire cast soft shadows on the walls. She looked around, taking in the simple room, the rough wooden table, the shelves with a few cups and plates, and the pot still gently bubbling on the stove. He offered her a place to sit. She placed the firewood near the stove and set the bundle on the table. When she unwrapped it, the smell of simple bread and dried meat filled the air. It was not a feast, but it was more than either of them had planned for that night. They sat across from each other, hands resting on the table, both unsure of what to say next. The cook broke a piece of bread and offered it to her. She accepted it with a small nod of thanks. As they ate, the silence felt less heavy. The crackling fire seemed to fill the space between their words. He told her about the ranch, about the long days and the quiet nights, about how he had come to this place thinking it would be temporary, only to find the years slipping by. She listened carefully, her eyes focused on him, not on the food or the fire breaths. When he finished, she spoke about her people, about moving with the seasons, about the stories her elders told by the fire to keep their history alive. Her words were simple, but they carried a deep sense of belonging, rattling the walls. He got up to add more wood to the fire. Hassett from Berg. The flames jumped higher, throwing more light into the room. The warmth spread, and the cold that had followed him all day began to fade from his bones. She noticed a small decoration hanging near the window, a simple string tied with a piece of red cloth. She asked about it. He smiled faintly and said it was his way of remembering the holidays from home, even if no one else was there to see it. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small carved piece of wood. It was shaped like a bird, its wings stretched wide. She placed it near the decoration, saying that it was a symbol of safe journeys and warm returns. The gesture caught him by surprise. He looked at the small carving, then at her, feeling something stir inside him that he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just gratitude. It was the feeling of being seen, of being understood in a quiet, gentle way. They continued to talk as the night grew deeper. The lantern burned low and the fire settled into a steady glow. They spoke about the land, about how it could be both kind and harsh, about how people learned to live with it rather than against it. At times they sat in silence, listening to the wind and the fire break. The silence didn't feel awkward anymore. It felt shared. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and slow, covering the tracks that had led her to the ranch. Inside, two people who had started the evening as strangers now felt like they were part of the same small world, at least for this night. He poured more warm drink into her cup, and she thanked him with a quiet smile. The warmth of the cup in her hands mirrored the warmth in the room. As the hours passed, he realized he wasn't thinking about how lonely he had felt earlier. The weight of the day had lifted, replaced by a simple peace. She seemed to feel it too, her shoulders relaxing, her voice softer. The night outside was still cold and wide, but inside the small kitchen there was light, warmth, and a connection that neither of them had expected when the sun went down. When the fire finally burned low and the lantern flickered, they both knew it was getting late, but neither rushed to leave or to say goodbye. The moment felt too important to hurry. They stood up from the table, stretching tired legs. He wrapped his coat tighter around himself, and she pulled her cloak close. Before she stepped toward the door, she turned to him and said that nights like this were rare, and that they should be remembered, not because they were perfect, but because they showed how small acts of kindness could change how the world felt, even just for a while. He nodded, not trusting himself to find the right words. He opened the door for her, and the cold air rushed in again. Break it. Snowflakes drifted through the light from inside, glowing for a moment before melting away. She stepped out into the night, her figure slowly fading into the soft white distance. He stood in the doorway, watching until he could no longer see her. When he closed the door, the room felt different. It was still small, still simple, but it no longer felt empty.
He looked at the small bird carving on the table and the red cloth by the window.
He smiled to himself, feeling a quiet hope settle in his chest. Outside, the plains stretched on under the falling snow. Inside, the ranch cook sat back down by the fire, knowing that this Christmas Eve would stay with him long after the snow had melted and the winter had passed. Morning came slowly over the plains, not with bright colors or loud sounds, but with a soft gray light that slipped through the small kitchen window. The ranch cook opened his eyes to the quiet crackle of the last coals in the stove. For a moment, he forgot where he was and what day it was. Then he remembered the night before, the warm fire, the simple meal, and the woman who had walked into his life like a gentle change in the wind. He sat up on the narrow bench where he had rested and rubbed his hands together to chase away the cold. The air inside was cooler now, but it still felt kinder than the world outside. He stood and added a few pieces of wood to the stove. The flames rose again, filling the room with a soft orange glow. He looked around the kitchen, noticing how different it felt from the day before. The small bird carving still sat near the window, catching the light. The red cloth swayed slightly as the warm air moved around it. These small things made the room feel less like a place of work and more like a place where something had happened, something that mattered. He poured water into a pot and set it on the stove. As it warmed, he found himself thinking about her. He wondered where she had gone after leaving, how far she had walked through the snow, and if she had found shelter that kept her warm. He hoped she had. When the water began to steam, he made a simple breakfast. The smell of warm food filled the room again, and for a moment he imagined her sitting across from him, her hands wrapped around a cup, her eyes focused on the fire. A soft knock came at the door. He froze, his heart beating faster than it had any right to over a simple sound. He set the spoon down and walked to the door, opening it slowly. She stood there, just beyond the threshold, her cloak dusted with fresh snow. Her hair was tied back, and her face looked tired, but there was a calm in her eyes that hadn't been there the night before. In her hands she held a small bundle again, lighter this time. He stepped aside, and she came in, the cold following her for only a moment before the door closed behind her. They greeted each other with small, quiet words. He offered her a seat, and she placed the bundle on the table. Inside were a few dried berries and a strip of cured meat.
She said it was a way of saying thank you for the warmth and the meal the night before. He felt a simple happiness rise in him.
He poured her a cup of warm drink and handed it to her. She wrapped her hands around it and closed her eyes for a second, enjoying the heat. They sat together, not as strangers now, but not quite as friends either. There was something in between, something still finding its shape. He asked her about her morning, and she told him about waking before the sun, about checking on her family and helping prepare food for the day. She spoke of the way her people moved together, how everyone had a role, how even small tasks mattered. He listened, feeling a sense of respect grow inside him. He told her about the ranch, about the animals that needed care even in the cold, about the long hours and the quiet that came when the work was done. Brace. She asked him why he stayed. The question caught him off guard. He thought about it for a moment before answering. He said that at first he stayed because he had nowhere else to go. Over time, he stayed because the land had become part of him, even if he didn't always understand it. She nodded, as if that made sense to her. After breakfast, she stood and pulled her cloak tighter. But she said she needed to return to her people. But before she left, she invited him to walk with her for a short way. He hesitated, thinking about his work, about the ranch, about the day ahead. Then he looked at the small bird carving and felt that quiet hope again. He grabbed his coat and followed her outside. The world was bright with snow, the sky clear and pale blue. The air was sharp but clean. Each step they took made a soft crunch under their boots. They walked side by side, not too close, but close enough to feel each other's presence. She pointed out tracks in the snow, showing him how to tell which animal had passed and how long ago. He watched, fascinated by how the land spoke to her in ways he had never learned to hear. He showed her the fence lines, the barns in the distance, the way the ranch stretched out across the plains. He talked about the work that waited for him, about fixing broken boards and checking on the animals. They stopped near a small rise in the land where they could see far in every direction. The plains rolled out like a white sea, and the sky seemed endless above them. She told him about the stories her elders shared, stories of the land as a living thing, not just a place to stand or work. She said the land remembered those who treated it with care. Breath. He thought about the years he had spent here, how he had taken from the land without ever really thanking it. The idea stayed with him, heavy, but not uncomfortable, like a truth he had needed to hear. Breaths. They stood in silence for a while, letting the wind and the wide view fill the space between their words. Finally, she said it was time for her to go. Her path led away from the ranch back toward the low hills in the distance. He felt a small twist in his chest, a feeling he didn't quite understand. He didn't want the walk to end, but he knew it had to. But Tosa, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a thin strip of cloth, woven with simple patterns. She tied it gently around his wrist and said it was a reminder of the morning and the path they had shared. He looked at it, then at her, and thanked her in a quiet voice. They parted there, each turning back toward their own world. Break. He watched her walk away until she became a small shape against the snow. He worked on the fence, checked on the animals, and carried wood to the kitchen, but everything felt slightly different. The wind felt less harsh. The silence felt less heavy. Other ranch hands noticed the change in him. He spoke more, smiled more, and listened when they talked. He found himself sharing small stories about the land, about the tracks in the snow, about the idea of the plains remembering those who cared for them. As evening came, he returned to the kitchen and lit the lantern. The room filled with soft light again. He looked at the table where they had sat, at the bird carving in the red cloth, and then at the strip of woven fabric on his wrist. He made a simple meal and ate alone, but the loneliness he had felt so often before didn't settle in the same way.
There was a sense of connection now, like a thread that reached beyond the walls of the kitchen and into the wide, quiet world.
Later, as he sat by the fire, he thought about what she had said, about small acts of kindness and the paths people shared, even for a short time.
He wondered if this was the beginning of something new, not just between him and her, but between him and the land he called home.
Outside, the stars came out, bright and steady in the cold sky. Inside, the fire burned low, and the ranch cook sat with a calm heart, knowing that the night before had not been a single moment that faded, but the first step on a longer path he was only just beginning to walk. The next day began with a soft pink light rising over the edge of the plains. The sky looked wide and open, like it was holding a promise that had not yet been spoken. Breath. The ranch cook stood outside the kitchen for a moment, breathing in the cold morning air. The woven strip of cloth still rested around his wrist, and every time he noticed it, he felt a quiet sense of purpose. His work waited for him, as it always did. The animals needed care, the fences needed checking, and the kitchen needed fire and food. But as he moved through his tasks, his thoughts kept drifting back to the woman and the way she spoke about the land, the way she listened, and the calm strength in her voice. By midday, the sun had climbed higher, and the snow began to soften under its gentle warmth. The ranch hands gathered near the barns to eat their simple meal. The cook brought out a pot of stew and handed out bowls. As Theoping's simple conversation floated through the cold air, he noticed how different he felt among them. He listened more closely, asked more questions, and shared small stories instead of keeping to himself. One of the workers asked about the woven cloth on his wrist. The cook hesitated for a moment, then told them about the woman who had visited, about the walk they had taken, and about what she had said about the land remembering those who cared for it. Some of the men nodded. Others stayed quiet, thinking. The cook didn't try to explain further. He didn't need to. The words felt right just as they were. Later that afternoon, as he carried a basket of supplies back toward the kitchen, he saw a familiar shape in the distance. A figure stood near the edge of the open field, her cloak moving gently in the wind. His heart lifted in a way he had not expected. He set the basket down and walked toward her, careful not to rush. She smiled when she saw him. It was a small smile, but it felt warm, like the first light of a new day. She said she had come to bring a message. Her people were preparing a small gathering that evening, a time to share food, stories, and warmth as the long winter continued. She said he was welcome to come, if he wished. The invitation surprised him. He thought about the ranch, the work that always waited, and the way he usually spent his evenings alone by the fire. Then he thought about the walk they had taken, the stories she had shared, and the way the world had felt different since that night. He told her he would come. As the sun began to sink, he finished his tasks faster than usual. He washed his hands, changed into his cleanest shirt, and brushed the dust from his coat. He wasn't trying to look special. He just wanted to show respect. The woman waited near the edge of the ranch. Together they walked across the plains toward the low hills where her people had set up their shelter for the season. The sky turned soft shades of orange and purple as they walked. The air grew colder, but the quiet between them felt comfortable, not empty. When they arrived, he saw small lights glowing in the distance. Fires burned low and steady, and people moved gently around them, carrying bowls, talking in soft voices, and laughing in quiet bursts. The woman led him forward. Some faces turned to look at him, curious, but not unkind. But he felt a small wave of nervousness, but he held his head up and followed her lead. She introduced him with simple words, saying he was a friend from the ranch who had shared warmth and food on a cold night. Breath. That was all. It felt like enough. They gave him a place near one of the fires. Someone handed him a bowl of warm soup, and the steam rose into the cold air. He took a sip and felt the heat spread through him, just like it had in his own kitchen. Around the fire, people began to share stories. An elder spoke about past winters, about times when the cold had been harder and the land less kind. A young voice followed, telling a story of finding a lost animal and bringing it home safely. Each story was simple, but each one carried a feeling of care and connection. The cook listened, drawn into the rhythm of the voices and the crackle of the fire. He felt like he was stepping into a world he had always seen from a distance but had never truly entered. The woman sat beside him. At one point she leaned over and quietly explained a part of a story he didn't understand. He thanked her, feeling grateful for her presence. As the night deepened, someone began to sing a soft, steady tune. Others joined in, their voices blending with the wind. The sound was gentle, not loud, and it seemed to move across the plains like a warm breath. The cook closed his eyes for a moment and let the sound wash over him. He felt a sense of belonging that he had not felt in a very long time. Later, when the fire burned low and the stories came to a close, the woman walked with him a short distance away from the gathering. The stars were bright above them, and the world felt wide and calm. She asked him how he felt about the evening. He thought for a moment before answering. He said it felt like being invited into a home he didn't know he was missing. She smiled at that, a deeper smile this time, and said that sometimes people found their way to places not by looking, but by listening. They stood there in silence, watching their breath turn into small clouds in the cold air. When it was time to part, she told him that her people would be staying in the area for some time. Their paths might cross again, she said. He nodded, feeling a quiet happiness at the thought. The walk back to the ranch felt shorter than usual. The night air was cold, but his steps were light. Between he reached the kitchen, he lit the lantern and sat at the table for a moment, thinking about the fire, the stories, and the voices that still echoed in his mind.
The next morning, he woke with a new sense of energy.
The day's work felt less like a burden and more like a part of the life he was building. Over the next few days, the woman visited the ranch more often. Brats. Sometimes she came alone, sometimes with a younger member of her group. They brought small gifts, like dried herbs or woven pieces, and he shared what he could from the kitchen. They talked about many things. He told her about his childhood, about the places he had lived before coming to the plains. She told him about her family, about the lessons she had learned from her elders, and about her hopes for the future. They laughed sometimes, especially when he tried to learn a few words from her language and got them wrong. Braish. She corrected him gently, and he tried again, smiling at his own mistakes. The other ranch hands began to notice her visits. Some were curious, some cautious, but most were simply interested. The cook found himself acting as a bridge, sharing simple stories and easing small worries. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the snow with golden light, the woman and the cook stood near the fence line looking out over the plains. She said the land felt different here, like it was ready for something new. But he looked at the wide open space and thought about the changes he felt inside himself. He agreed, passed. The quiet connection between them grew stronger. It wasn't the loud or dramatic. Dispatch. It was built on small moments, shared meals, and gentle words. One evening, as they sat by the kitchen fire, she asked him what he wanted for the future. The question stayed with him for a long moment. He had spent so many years just getting through each day that he had forgotten to think about what might come next. Bah! Finally, he said he wanted a life that felt full, not just busy. A life where he wasn't alone, even when he was by himself. She listened, her eyes thoughtful. She said that the future was like the land, but changed with every step a person took. He looked at the woven cloth on his wrist, now worn and faded from his work, and felt that she was right. Outside, the wind moved across the plains, steady and patient. Inside, two people sat by the fire sharing a quiet moment that felt like the beginning of something they were both still learning to understand. The world beyond the kitchen was still wide and uncertain, but for the first time in a long while the ranch cook felt ready to walk forward, one step at a time, guided by the simple truth that connection, once found, had a way of lighting even the coldest path. The morning sun rose behind a line of thin clouds, spreading soft light across the plains. The snow had started to melt in small patches, revealing dark earth beneath. The ranch cook stepped outside the kitchen and paused for a moment, feeling the change in the air. Winter was still present, but it no longer felt as heavy as before. The land seemed to be breathing slow and steady as if it was preparing for something new. He touched the woven cloth on his wrist, now faded and worn from days of work. It had become a part of him. Like a quiet promise he carried everywhere he went.
His day began as usual, with the steady rhythm of simple tasks.
He checked the stove, prepared food for the ranch hands, and carried water from the well. But his thoughts kept drifting beyond the fences, toward the low hills where the woman and her people stayed. Later that morning, one of the ranch hands came into the kitchen and said there were visitors near the gate. The cook wiped his hands and stepped outside. He saw the woman standing with two younger members of her group. They carried baskets and bundles wrapped in cloth. The wind moved gently around them, lifting the edges of their cloaks. He walked toward them, feeling a quiet happiness rise in his chest. She greeted him with a calm voice and said they had come to trade. Her people had gathered herbs and dried foods from the land, and they hoped to exchange them for flour, salt, and a few tools. The cook nodded and led them to the storage area near the kitchen. He brought out what he could, careful to keep things fair and simple. They placed their baskets on the table and unwrapped their goods. The air filled with the scent of dried plants and earth. As they worked, the younger ones looked around with curious eyes. They asked questions about the ranch, about the animals, and about how the cook learned to make food for so many people. He answered as best he could, showing them the stove and the shelves lined with jars and tins. Their faces lit up when he let them taste a small piece of bread fresh from the pan. The woman watched, her expression warm and thoughtful. When the trading was done, she asked if he would walk with her for a while. He agreed, and they left the others talking quietly near the kitchen. They followed a narrow path that ran along the edge of the fields, where the snow had melted into thin streams of water. The ground was soft, and their steps left clear marks behind them. Whoa. She spoke about the changes she felt in the air, how her people were preparing to move when the season shifted. She said they would not stay in this place forever. The words settled into him slowly. He had known this, of course.
The plains were wide, and paths crossed and separated all the time. Still, hearing it made something tighten inside his chest.
He told her that the ranch would always be here, that the fences and buildings tied him to this place. But she nodded and said that everyone had something that held them, whether it was land, people, or memories. They walked in silence for a while, listening to the wind and the distant sound of birds. When they reached a small rise in the land, they stopped. From there, they could see both the ranch and the low hills beyond. The world stretched out in both directions, open and calm.
She asked him what he thought about when he looked at the land now.
He thought carefully before answering.
He said that before. He saw work, cold, and long days.
Now he saw paths, stories, and people he had not noticed before. She smiled at that, saying that the land had many faces, and it showed different ones to those who took the time to look.
They sat on a fallen log, the sun warming their faces. For a moment, neither spoke.
The quiet felt deep but gentle. He wanted to say something about her leaving one day, about how that made him feel, but the words stayed in his throat. She seemed to sense it. She said that even when people walked different paths, the moments they shared did not disappear. They became part of who they were. Her words stayed with him, heavy and comforting at the same time. They returned to the kitchen to find the younger visitors laughing with the ranch hands, sharing simple jokes and small pieces of food. The sight filled him with a strange sense of pride, like he had helped open a door between two worlds. As the day moved on, the visitors left, carrying their traded goods and waving as they walked back toward the hills. The cook stood and watched them go, the woman's figure slowly blending into the wide landscape. That evening, the sky filled with soft clouds that caught the colors of the setting sun. The plains glowed in shades of gold and pale red. The cook made a larger meal than usual and invited a few of the ranch hands to eat with him in the kitchen instead of outside. They sat around the rough table, sharing food and stories. One of them asked about the woman and her people. The cook spoke calmly, sharing what he had learned, not as a lesson, but as a story. He talked about the way they saw the land, the way they moved together, and the value they placed on small acts of kindness. The others listened, some nodding, some asking questions. The mood in the room felt open and curious, not tense. Later, when the others left, the cook cleaned up and sat by the fire alone. The woven cloth on his wrist caught the light, and he ran his fingers over it slowly. He thought about the idea of paths crossing and separating. He thought about how his life had felt so still before, like the frozen ground in winter, and how now it felt like something beneath the surface was starting to move. The next day the weather changed. A strong wind swept across the plains, carrying clouds that darkened the sky. The ranch hands worked quickly, securing loose boards and checking the animals. The cook moved between the kitchen and the barns, helping where he could. The wind cut through his coat, and the air felt sharp. In the distance, he saw a small group approaching. It was the woman and two others, their cloaks pulled tight against the wind. He walked out to meet them. Breath. She said the wind was a sign of a coming shift, a time when people needed to look after one another more closely. They stood near the fence, shouting slightly to be heard over the sound of the wind. He offered them shelter in the kitchen until the weather eased. Inside, the fire burned bright, and the walls blocked most of the noise from outside. The younger visitors warmed their hands and laughed softly, relieved to be out of the cold. The woman thanked him, her eyes meeting his in a way that felt deeper than words.
As they waited, she told him about a story her elders used to share.
It was about a traveler who walked across many lands, always moving, always searching. One day the traveler found a place where the ground was warm and the people were kind. The traveler stayed for a season, thinking it would only be a short rest. But the season turned into a year, and the year into many years. The traveler eventually left, but the place remained in the traveler's heart, shaping every step that came after. The cook listened, feeling the story settle into him like a quiet echo of his own life. When the wind finally calmed, the visitors prepared to leave. The woman paused at the door. She said that her people would likely move when the snow melted fully, following the paths they had always followed. The cook nodded, his throat tight. He told her that he hoped their paths would cross again, wherever she went. She reached out and touched the woven cloth on his wrist lightly, then pulled a small bead from her pocket and pressed it into his hand. It was smooth and pale, shaped by time and water. She said it was a reminder that even stones carried stories from every place they had been. He closed his fingers around it, feeling its cool surface. They stood there for a moment, neither wanting to be the first to turn away. Finally, she stepped outside, and he followed her to the edge of the yard. The wind had settled, and the sky was clear again. They parted with a quiet nod, both carrying more in their hearts than they could say. That night the cook sat by the fire, the bead and the bird carving on the table before him. He thought about the traveler in the story, about seasons and paths, and about how some moments, no matter how brief, became part of a person forever.
Outside, the plains lay wide and open under the stars.
Inside, the kitchen felt warm and full, not just with fire and light, but with the growing understanding that change was coming, and that he would meet it not with fear, but with the quiet strength he had found in connection, kindness, and the simple truth that every path, once crossed, left a mark that never fully faded. The snow finally began to pull back from the land, not all at once, but in slow and gentle steps. Dark lines of earth showed through the white, and small streams of water ran across the fields where the sun touched the ground. The plains looked like they were waking up after a long sleep. The ranch cook noticed the change each morning when he stepped outside. The air still held a chill, but there was a softness in it now. Birds returned in small groups, their calls breaking the wide silence. The woven cloth on his wrist had faded even more, but he kept it there like a part of his own story. Word spread that the woman and her people would soon move on, following the path they always followed when the seasons shifted. The cook felt the news settle into him slowly, like a stone dropped into deep water. He went through his days with care, making meals, checking fences, and helping where he could. But in quiet moments, his eyes drifted toward the low hills, wondering when he would see her again. One afternoon, as the sky filled with soft clouds, he saw her walking toward the ranch alone. Her steps were calm, but there was something different in the way she moved, like she carried a weight she did not want to show. He met her near the gate. She told him that her people would leave in 2 days. The land ahead would lead them to new places, new water, and new shelter. It was the path they had always walked, and they would walk it again. He nodded, though his chest felt tight. They walked together along the fence line, the ground soft under their feet. The world felt quiet, like it was listening to them.
She said she wanted to thank him not just for the warmth and the food, but for the way he had opened his life to her and her people.
She said it had made this place feel like more than just another stop on a long journey.
He told her that she had changed the way he saw the land and the people on it.
He said he felt less alone now, even when the kitchen was quiet and the fire burned low. They stopped near the small rise where they had stood before, looking out over the plains. The ranch lay behind them. The low hills stretched ahead. She asked him what he would do when she was gone. The question stayed in the air between them. He said he would keep working, keep caring for the ranch, and keep sharing what he had learned. He said he wanted to be someone who helped people feel welcome, even if only for a moment. She smiled, a gentle smile that held both warmth and sadness. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of cloth brace. When she opened it, he saw that it was woven with simple patterns like the strip she had tied around his wrist, but larger.
She said it was for the kitchen, a way to remember that the fire there had been a place of kindness, not just work.
Breath. He took it carefully, feeling the soft fabric between his fingers. They stood there for a long moment, neither speaking. When they finally turned back toward the ranch, the sky had begun to darken. The first stars appeared, small and steady. The next day, the ranch felt different. The cook moved through his tasks with a quiet focus. The ranch hands noticed his silence and gave him space. That evening, the woman and a few of her people came one last time. Yes, they brought simple gifts, dried herbs, small carvings, and woven pieces. The cook shared what he could from the kitchen, and they sat together around the fire, but this time there was a feeling of goodbye in every word.
The cook shared a story of his own, about leaving his home long ago and finding a new life on the plains.
He spoke about feeling lost, and then about finding connection in a place he had never expected. The woman listened closely, her eyes calm and steady. When the fire burned low, they stood. Outside, the night was clear and quiet. She stepped forward and placed her hand over the woven cloth on his wrist for a brief moment. Then she pressed her palm against the small bead he kept in his pocket, like she was sealing a promise neither of them had spoken.
Paths crossed for a reason, even if they did not run together forever. He nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deep inside him.
The next morning he woke before the sun. The plains were wrapped in a soft gray light. He stepped outside and saw movement in the distance. The woman and her people were already on their way, their shapes small against the wide land. He stood there, hands in his coat pockets, watching. She turned once, as if she felt his eyes on her. Burra. She lifted her hand in a small wave. He raised his hand in return. Then they were gone, blending into the horizon. The days that followed felt quiet, but not empty. The cook hung the woven cloth near the window in the kitchen. The bird carving and the small bead sat on the table below it. The room felt like it held stories now, not just tools and smoke. He began to invite the ranch hands to eat together more often. Breaths. They shared meals, talked about their lives, and laughed over small things. The kitchen became a place where people stayed a little longer instead of rushing back to their work. Sometimes travelers passed through. The cook offered them water, food, and a place to rest. He listened to their stories, just as he had listened to hers. The land continued to change. The snow melted away, and green pushed up through the soil. The plains filled with color and movement. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in soft gold, the cook stood outside and looked toward the low hills. He didn't know where the woman was now or what she was seeing, but he felt a quiet connection, like a thread that stretched across the wide land. He went back inside, lit the fire, and sat at the table. Breaths. He thought about how his life had been before, how the days had felt long and empty. He thought about how a single night, a simple meal, and a quiet invitation had changed the way he walked through the world. He realized that the change was not just about her. It was about what he had become because of her. He had learned to see people, not just places. He had learned to listen, not just speak. He had learned that even in a wide and lonely land, connection could grow like a small fire, steady and strong. As the night settled over the ranch, he felt a deep sense of calm. The plains outside were still wide and uncertain, but he no longer felt small within them. He had found a way to belong, not to one place or one path, but to the shared space where people met, listened, and cared for one another.